In the summer of 2010, the eyes of a football-obsessed nation turned towards South Africa, where England arrives carrying the weight of history, expectation and belief. This was supposed to be the year, a squad brimming with Premier League icons, Gerrard, Lampard, Rooney, Terry, men who dominated club football, now united under the rigid discipline and tactical pedigree of Fabio Capello. On paper, it was one of England's strongest lineups in decades. The so-called golden generation was older, wiser and battle-hardened. Veterans mixed with rising stars, a world-class backline, midfield dynamism and attacking threat. All the ingredients were there. But as the tournament unfolded, dreams gave way to doubt. From the very first match, signs of disconnect emerged. Disjointed play, uncharacteristic errors and uneasy tension between players and manager. And then, the moment that came to define the campaign. Frank Lampard's ghost goal against Germany, a shot that thundered off the crossbar and clearly crossed the line, but was never given. It was more than a mistake, it was a metaphor for the tournament, something that could have been glorious, but never quite was. In this deep dive, we break down the 2010 England World Cup squad, every selection, every omission, and every turning point. We'll explore the strategy behind Capello's decisions, the locker room dynamics, the weight of public pressure, and how a team with so much talent left South Africa in disappointment. This is the story of England's 2010 World Cup squad, explained. Jermaine Defoe entered the 2010 World Cup on the back of one of the best seasons of his career. Playing for Tottenham Hotspur, he scored 18 Premier League goals, including a record equalling 5 in a single game against Wigan, a rare feat that showcased his instinctive finishing and killer movement in the box. Despite often being overshadowed by bigger names like Wayne Rooney or Emile Heskey in the England setup, Defoe was in red-hot form and made a compelling case to be more than just a squad player. Fabio Capello, known for his rigid system and conservative preferences, initially leaned toward the physical presence of Heskey to partner Rooney, but when England faltered in the opening 2 games, drawing both and failing to find attacking rhythm, Capello turned to Defoe. That decision proved crucial. Defoe started against Slovenia in a must-win match and delivered England's only goal, turning in a sharp, low cross from James Milner with a typical striker's finish. It was the kind of goal only someone like Defoe scores. Quick, instinctive, and executed without hesitation. It not only secured England's place in the round of 16, but also validated Defoe's role as a decisive weapon in a squad that had, until that point, struggled to find cutting edge. Unfortunately, the momentum didn't last. Defoe started again in the infamous 4-1 loss to Germany, but struggled along with the rest of the team as England were tactically outclassed and emotionally unravelled. Still, while the likes of Rooney underperformed and midfield cohesion never quite clicked, Defoe emerged with some credit, a sharp striker who seized his opportunity, albeit briefly, on the biggest stage. He wasn't England's leading man, but in a tournament where few delivered, Jermaine Defoe left with his head high and his moment in history secured. If Jermaine Defoe arrived in South Africa as a man in form, Wayne Rooney arrived as a man on whom a nation's hopes were stacked. Just 24 years old, Rooney was already a global superstar, the fierce, fearless talisman of Manchester United and England alike. His 2009-2010 club season had been phenomenal. 34 goals in all competitions, a career best tally that saw him named PFA Players' Player of the Year. With Cristiano Ronaldo gone from Old Trafford, Rooney had stepped into the spotlight and carried United's attack almost single-handedly. There was no doubt this was supposed to be his World Cup. But, for reasons still debated today, Rooney never got going in South Africa. He looks off the pace from the opening match against the United States, where his touch was heavy, his movement laboured, and his temper close to the surface. England's goalless draw against Algeria, perhaps the low point of the group stage, culminated in Rooney turning toward a TV camera at full time and snapping, "Nice to see your own fans booing you, that's loyal supporters." It was a moment that perfectly captured the disconnect between Rooney and the fans, between the squad and the expectations they carried. Tactically, Capello's setup didn't help. Rooney was often isolated, forced to drop deep to find the ball, with little support in behind. His usual strike partner, Emile Heskey, offered physicality but no goal threat, and Rooney, accustomed to fast, fluid attacking football at Manchester United, found himself trapped in a rigid system with no rhythm. Despite starting every game, Rooney failed to score a single goal at the tournament, a statistic that haunted him long after England's exit. In the round of 16 against Germany, with England chasing the game, Rooney looked exhausted and emotionally drained. He wasn't the player who had terrorised Premier League defences all year. He was a shadow of himself, burdened by pressure and unable to spark the revival England so desperately needed. Looking back, Rooney's 2010 World Cup was a defining disappointment. It wasn't just the lack of goals, it was the absence of fire, of inspiration, of leadership. The player who once played with reckless brilliance looked shackled both by tactics and by the crushing weight of national expectation. For many, this tournament marked the beginning of the long, complicated relationship between Rooney and the World Cup, one of immense promise, but ultimately unfulfilled potential. In a squad often defined by rigid roles and cautious tactics, Peter Crouch remained one of England's most curious weapons, a 6'7" striker with a surprisingly graceful touch and a better goal-to-game ratio than almost anyone else in the squad. By the time the 2010 World Cup rolled around, Crouch had become something of a cult figure in English football, not just for his robotic goal celebrations or gangly frame, but because he delivered. In fact, leading up to South Africa, his record for England was staggering. 21 goals in 38 appearances, including 8 goals in 2010 alone, most of them in warm-up friendlies and qualifiers. If international form meant anything, Crouch had more than earned his seat on that plane. Yet, under Fabio Capello, he was never truly trusted. The Italian manager preferred the physical hold-up play of Emile Heskey, despite Heskey's barren scoring record, and Crouch was often relegated to late substitute appearances, a plan B that England rarely committed to fully. His tournament role reflected that. He made 3 appearances, all from the bench, and never started a game. Against the United States and Algeria, he was brought on in the dying minutes, asked to change games already slipping away. And while his aerial threat caused panic in defences, he was rarely given the minutes or the support to make a real impact. Perhaps Capello saw him as too unorthodox, too awkward for the kind of rigid, structured system he wanted to enforce. But many fans and pundits at the time questioned the logic. Why bring a striker with such a prolific record and such a unique presence, only to leave him on the sidelines when England's attack was visibly faltering? In hindsight, Crouch's 2010 World Cup was a missed opportunity. Not for him, he did what he could with the minutes he had, but for the team that needed goals, unpredictability, and something different. Crouch offered all 3. He wasn't England's superstar, but he was a specialist, and specialists win tournaments when used wisely. In the end, England didn't take that risk. Few players divide opinion among England fans quite like Emile Heskey. By the time the 2010 World Cup began, Heskey was already a veteran of the game, 32 years old with over a decade of international experience. He was never a prolific scorer, managing just 7 goals in 62 England caps by the tournament's start, but what he lacked in numbers, Fabio Capello believed he made up for in function. Heskey was chosen not to score, but to facilitate, a selfless, physically dominant forward whose job was to bring others into play, particularly Wayne Rooney. This tactical justification had historical precedent. Rooney's breakout performances at Euro 2004 had come alongside Heskey, and Capello believed that same partnership could reignite Rooney's magic in South Africa. In the manager's mind, Heskey was the essential foil, the player who would win headers, occupy defenders and open up space for England's main man. But the gamble didn't pay off. Heskey started the first 2 group games against the United States and Algeria, and while his work rate was never in question, his limitations became glaringly obvious. His link-up play was functional, yes, but not incisive. England's attack looked flat, predictable and slow. Against the USA, he actually assisted Gerrard's early goal with a clever pass, but then later missed a one-on-one chance that could have won the game. It became emblematic of his role, vital to the build-up, unreliable at the finish. As pressure mounted and goals remained scarce, Capello finally dropped Heskey for the 3rd group match, turning to Jermaine Defoe, who promptly scored the winner. From that point on, Heskey was effectively sidelined, making only a brief appearance in the second half of the round of 16 clash against Germany when the game was already slipping away. In the end, Heskey's 2010 World Cup summed up the limitations of England's tactical thinking at the time. He was a symbol of Capello's loyalty to structure over spontaneity, a striker chosen to support rather than score. And while his unselfish play may have had merit, it raised a painful question. In a tournament where goals win games, could England really afford to start the centre forward who rarely scored? For Heskey, South Africa was his international swan song. He retired from England duty shortly after the tournament, quietly, without drama. His role had always been misunderstood and perhaps misused. He gave everything for the team, but in a campaign defined by attacking frustration, his selection became one of its defining debates. In a squad often criticised for lacking width and dynamism, Shaun Wright-Phillips offered something different. Raw pace, directness, and the ability to beat a man. The son of Ian Wright, he had long lived in the shadow of his famous name, but by 2010 he had carved out his own path as a dependable if inconsistent winger, playing for Manchester City after an earlier stint with Chelsea. Though not an automatic starter at club level that season, Capello saw Wright-Phillips as a useful tactical option, an injection of energy off the bench. His inclusion in the final 23-man squad raised eyebrows, especially with Theo Walcott left out entirely despite scoring a hat-trick in qualifying against Croatia. Capello favoured Wright-Phillips's defensive discipline and experience over Walcott's unpredictability. It was a decision that would be heavily scrutinised as the tournament unfolded. Wright-Phillips featured in 2 of England's group stage matches, coming off the bench against the USA and starting against Algeria. In both appearances, he struggled to impose himself. Against the USA, he replaced James Milner early and brought urgency, but his final ball repeatedly let him down. In the dire 0-0 draw with Algeria, one of England's most toothless World Cup performances, he was given a starting role on the right wing, but again failed to deliver meaningful service. Time after time, he would dart past the defender only for the cross to miss its mark or the attack to break down. It was a frustrating pattern. Plenty of effort, but no cutting edge. Wright-Phillips had all the tools to stretch defences and open up space, yet the final product was missing when England needed it most. With the team desperate for goals and creativity, he was substituted and did not feature again in the tournament. In hindsight, Wright-Phillips's World Cup campaign felt like a missed chance, not just for him, but for England's wider tactical plan. His selection over Walcott seemed conservative, and his performances never fully justified it. He had the legs, he had the heart, but not the end product, a reflection in many ways of England's campaign as a whole. If tournaments are often defined by the players who weren't used, Michael Carrick may be one of England's most quietly wasted talents in 2010. At 28 years old, Carrick was entering what many would consider his prime, a multiple-time Premier League champion with Manchester United, known for his calm passing, positional intelligence, and ability to dictate tempo from deep. In a midfield full of powerful runners and attacking threats, Lampard, Gerrard, Barry, Carrick was the one player who offered control. But in South Africa, he was barely seen. Carrick went the entire tournament without playing a single minute. Capello's midfield pairing of Frank Lampard and Steven Gerrard, famously unbalanced in previous tournaments, was once again favoured, with Gareth Barry holding behind them after recovering from injury just before the group stage. Even when England struggled to maintain possession, failed to build from the back, and were overrun by Germany in the round of 16, Carrick remained glued to the bench. It was baffling to many observers. England's midfield, though full of talent, lacked rhythm. Lampard and Gerrard both wanted to drive forward. Barry, while solid, was returning from injury and struggled with mobility. In that setup, Carrick could have offered something different, a metronome, someone to knit together defence and attack, someone to slow the game down when needed. Instead, Capello stuck with force over finesse, and England paid the price. Perhaps Carrick was too subtle for England's setup. His strengths were never flashy, he didn't charge into tackles or score screamers. But those who watched him regularly for Manchester United understood his value. He made teams tick. Under Capello, that type of player wasn't trusted. In many ways, Carrick's World Cup summed up his entire England career, underused, misunderstood, and often the victim of tactical rigidity.
By 2010, James Milner had already carved out a reputation as one of English football's most tireless and dependable performers. Just 24, he had become a central figure at Aston Villa, earning the PFA Young Player of the Year award after a standout season in which he thrived in a central midfield role. His versatility, work rate and discipline made him a manager's dream, and in Fabio Capello's rigid tactical framework, that dependability made Milner a safe bet. But his World Cup experience got off to a chaotic, almost surreal start. Milner was named in the starting 11 for England's opening match against the USA, deployed out wide, a role he was capable of filling, but far from his best in. Just 30 minutes in, with the heat of Rustenburg sapping energy and England looking flat, Milner was subbed off. Officially, it was down to illness. Unofficially, it felt like a panic move, a player thrown into the cauldron, off form, out of position and out of sync. It could have shattered a lesser player. But Milner regrouped. After sitting out the goalless draw with Algeria, he was brought back in for England's must-win final group game against Slovenia. This time, he delivered. Starting on the right flank again, Milner played with far more authority and composure. In the 23rd minute, he whipped in a precise low cross into the box, a ball that Jermaine Defoe pounced on for England's only goal of the match, the one that sent them into the knockout stages. It was a moment of quality in a tournament short on them, and Milner had provided it. He kept his place for the round of 16 match against Germany, but like much of the squad, found himself overwhelmed by the pace and tactical intelligence of the opposition. England's midfield couldn't cope, the defence collapsed, and Milner's steady presence was lost in the chaos. He was subbed off with the game slipping away, and with it, England's World Cup. Still, Milner walked away with quiet credit. He hadn't lit up the tournament, but he had shown the mental toughness to recover from a disastrous start and still contribute meaningfully. He was the kind of player who didn't grab headlines, but the kind you always wanted in the trenches. In a squad riddled with underperformance and uncertainty, Milner did what Milner always did, the job he was asked to do, without fuss and with everything he had.
Of all the names in England's 2010 squad, Gareth Barry may have been the least glamorous, but arguably one of the most important to Fabio Capello's vision. A composed, left-footed midfielder with excellent positional sense and a tidy passing range, Barry was England's unofficial balance point. The man tasked with shielding the back four and anchoring a midfield packed with attacking instincts. In a side trying to fit Frank Lampard and Steven Gerrard into the same 11, Barry was supposed to be the one who made it all work. But disaster struck just weeks before the tournament. In May 2010, Barry suffered an ankle ligament injury playing for Manchester City. For a while, it looked like he might miss the tournament altogether. Capello waited until the final moment to confirm his inclusion, and while Barry was clear to travel, it was clear he wasn't quite at full match fitness. England took the risk anyway, and would pay for it later. Barry missed the opening group game against the USA, where England looked disjointed in midfield without a natural holding player. He returned for the Algeria match, but the team still lacked tempo and fluidity. In the decisive third group game against Slovenia, Barry performed solidly, helping England to a clean sheet and allowing Gerrard and Lampard to push higher up. He looked to be growing into the role, steady, unspectacular, but essential. Then came Germany. In the round of 16 clash, England were exposed brutally. Germany's midfield, spearheaded by a young Mesut Ozil, ran riot. They passed quickly, moved intelligently, and dragged Barry across the pitch in ways he simply couldn't keep up with. At times, he looked a step slow then too, and by the time Ozil breezed past him down the right flank to assist Germany's fourth goal, the tactical gamble had come undone. It wasn't that Barry played poorly by his own standards, it was that he was asked to do too much too soon after a serious injury in a role that required peak sharpness. He had the right brain, the right discipline, but not the legs, and England had no backup plan. In the end, Barry became a symbol of the wider imbalance in England's approach. A team full of attacking talent, but reliant on a single player to hold the whole thing together. Capello needed Barry to be perfect. He wasn't. But in truth, it was the system, not just the man, that failed.
There was a time when Joe Cole was hailed as England's great hope, the street footballer in a world of systems, the player with flair, unpredictability, and that rarest of English traits, imagination. And even though by 2010 his star had dimmed slightly, having struggled for game time at Chelsea under a succession of managers, Cole was still seen by many as England's wildcard, a player who could unlock a defence, who could make something happen out of nothing. He was exactly what England were missing. But Fabio Capello didn't see it that way. Cole made the final 23-man squad, yes, but it always felt like he was an outsider looking in. He didn't feature at all in the opening 2 group games, watching from the bench as England stumbled to a 1-1 draw with the USA and sleepwalked through a goalless nightmare against Algeria. With the team crying out for invention and spark, Capello resisted the call to unleash Cole, even as pundits, ex-players and fans began to clamour for his inclusion. He finally got his chance, if you could call it that, in the 76th minute against Slovenia, coming on as a late substitute with England clinging to a fragile 1-0 lead. His cameo was brief, tidy, energetic, but not enough to make a mark. Then again in the round of 16 against Germany, with England chasing a 2-goal deficit, Cole was thrown on in the 64th minute. It was a desperate move rather than a strategic one, and by then it was already too late. In total, Joe Cole played just 40 minutes of World Cup football in South Africa. He didn't start a single game. For a player whose natural game thrived on rhythm and confidence, being used as a last-ditch plan C never gave him the platform to shine. And yet there remains a lingering sense that his creativity, his ability to operate in tight spaces, drift between lines, and do the unexpected could have been exactly what England needed earlier in the tournament, especially in those suffocating group stage matches. Cole's final bow for England came not long after the tournament. His international career faded quietly, almost cruelly, not with a bang, but with a shrug. But for many fans, he remains the symbol of what England too often ignored in that era. Flair, freedom, and imagination sacrificed at the altar of structure and caution. By the time England arrived in South Africa, Frank Lampard was in the form of his life. He had just come off a remarkable season at Chelsea, scoring 27 goals in all competitions, an astonishing tally for a midfielder. He wasn't just one of the Premier League's best, he was one of Europe's most complete midfielders. Intelligent, tireless, and lethal arriving late into the box, Lampard had long lived in the shadow of questions about whether he could truly fit in England's midfield, but no one doubted his ability. He was Capello's trusted starter, and rightly so. Yet as the tournament unfolded, so did the same old questions. Lampard started all 4 of England's games in South Africa, but like many of his teammates, he looked shackled by the system. With Steven Gerrard pushed wide to accommodate him and Gareth Barry anchoring behind, Lampard was left in a kind of tactical limbo, still venturing forward, still taking shots, but never quite connecting with the game in the way he did for Chelsea. Then came the moment. In the round of 16 clash against Germany, with England trailing 2-1 but beginning to build momentum, Lampard picked up the ball outside the box and curled a strike that cannoned off the crossbar and dropped a full yard over the line. Every replay confirmed it. Everyone watching saw it. It was a goal, a clear, historic, equalising goal, except it wasn't given. No goal line technology, no VAR, no justice. The referee waved play on, and less than 10 minutes later, Germany scored again. The match ended 4-1, England were out, and Lampard's goal that never was became one of the most infamous injustices in World Cup history. It was cruel. Lampard, who had fought so hard to prove he could deliver on the biggest stage, had finally done so, and it was erased. His overall tournament performances may not have hit the heights of his club form, but he created chances, hit the target more than any other England player, and always looked most likely to make something happen. Yet all anyone remembers is the goal that wasn't. Looking back, Lampard's 2010 World Cup serves as both a personal and collective tragedy. A tournament that might have salvaged his England legacy instead became a case study in what went wrong for a generation of players. Too much talent, too little cohesion, and in Lampard's case, the wrong technology at the wrong time. In an England squad crying out for width and penetration, Aaron Lennon was supposed to be the antidote. At 23, he had just completed a strong season with Tottenham Hotspur, where his blistering pace, low centre of gravity, and ability to hug the touchline made him one of the Premier League's most dangerous wingers. Capello's decision to take Lennon over Theo Walcott wasn't without controversy, but it made tactical sense. Lennon was arguably more consistent, more defensively disciplined, and had improved his final ball. The theory was clear. He would stretch teams, create space, and supply service to Rooney and co. But theory rarely survives contact with the World Cup. Lennon started both of England's opening 2 group games against the USA and Algeria. In both matches, the script was the same. Bright early runs, quick feet, darting sprints into dangerous areas, and then nothing. His delivery, often hurried or misjudged, rarely found a target, and with England playing a narrow, congested style that lacked fluid movement in the final third, Lennon was frequently isolated on the wing, with few meaningful combinations and little support. His one-on-one threat became easy to double up on, and the rhythm of his club form never quite appeared. The pressure was immense. The world watched England fail to break down Algeria in one of the most toothless performances in their modern World Cup history. Lennon was withdrawn on 63 minutes. His next contribution? Nothing. He didn't start or appear again for the rest of the tournament. In a side desperate for invention and creativity, Capello instead turned to Shaun, Wright-Phillips and eventually Joe Cole. Lennon, the starter, had become a footnote. It wasn't entirely his fault. England's rigid system left little room for free-flowing wing play, and the team's slow central build-up starved him of early ball. But he didn't seize the few moments he had either. His World Cup campaign faded as quietly as it began. All pace, no punch. Looking back, Lennon's 2010 World Cup sums up the frustration of that generation. So much talent, never fully unleashed. He had the jet fuel, but England never built the engine to make him fly. When Rio Ferdinand limped out of training just days before England's opening match, the captain's armband was passed to Steven Gerrard, a last-minute promotion that was both natural and symbolic. Gerrard, 30 years old, was already a legend at Liverpool, having dragged them to Champions League glory with blood and thunder performances that defied logic. But in an England shirt, the story was more complicated. He had been brilliant, yes, but never fully settled. Always playing in someone else's space, always asked to compromise. In South Africa, that tension returned. Gerrard was nominally England's captain, leader in name and in spirit. But once again, he found himself out of position, shifted to the left to accommodate Lampard and Barry in central midfield. And yet, from the opening whistle, he still stood tallest. Just 4 minutes into the tournament, Gerrard burst through the USA defence, latching onto a Heskey pass and sliding the ball calmly past Tim Howard. It was a captain's moment, a call to arms. But it would prove to be a false dawn. England never found their rhythm. The midfield was disjointed, the attack laboured, and Gerrard, for all his energy and drive, couldn't stitch it all together from the flank. He ran, he tackled, he launched those trademark 40-yard passes, but it always felt like he was trying to do everything himself, and often for a team that didn't seem to know what it wanted to be. In the dismal 0-0 draw against Algeria, Gerrard was one of the few to show urgency, constantly pushing forward, demanding more, clashing with teammates who didn't match his intensity. He looked like a man desperately trying to pull the pieces together. In the 1-0 win over Slovenia, he played with more control, linking better with Milner and Defoe, and helped steer England into the knockout round. But it was clear this wasn't a cohesive team. This was a squad held together by willpower. And then came Germany. Gerrard wore the armband into Bloemfontein and did his best to rally England through the chaos. He created chances, nearly scored, and worked relentlessly. But it was never going to be enough. England were outclassed, tactically, technically, emotionally. Gerrard could feel the game slipping, but for once, there was no miracle in him. His tournament ended with quiet heartbreak. No scandal, no outburst, just a deep frustration that simmered behind his eyes. As captain, he had led by example. As a player, he had given everything. But once again, England had wasted its golden generation, and Gerrard was left carrying the weight. He would return for one more World Cup in 2014, but South Africa was his shot at redemption, the tournament he wanted to define his England legacy. Instead, it became a microcosm of his international career. Heroic effort in a system that never quite fit.
For Michael Dawson, the 2010 World Cup wasn't meant to happen. Not really. He wasn't in Fabio Capello's original 30-man provisional squad. He wasn't in the early conversations, the press predictions, or the warm-up friendlies. But when England's carefully assembled defensive core began to crack, fate offered Dawson the most bittersweet of opportunities, a late call-up to the world's biggest stage. When Rio Ferdinand suffered a knee ligament injury in training just days before the tournament opener, panic swept through the England camp. Dawson, who had been left out of the final 23, suddenly got the call.
He had to fly out, uncertain of whether he'd even be allowed to play due to FIFA's roster regulations. Eventually, the paperwork cleared. He was officially part of the squad. His dream had come true under the strangest of circumstances. At Tottenham, Dawson had just completed one of the best seasons of his career, helping Spurs finish in the top four and qualify for the Champions League. A strong, no-nonsense centre-back, he was admired for his bravery, leadership and aerial dominance. He wasn't as polished as Ferdinand or as comfortable on the ball as Ledley King, but he was solid, and in a squad suddenly thin at the back, that mattered. Yet in South Africa, Dawson never kicked a ball. He sat on the bench, watching as Ledley King limped out early. Matthew Upson struggled against Germany, and England's defence collapsed under pressure. Capello never turned to him, not even as a late substitute or rotation option. Dawson trained hard, kept his head down, and did what standby players so often do. Be ready, just in case, even when just in case never comes. He left the tournament with a cap still to earn, his World Cup experience reduced to training sessions, tactical meetings, and warm-ups. And yet, Dawson's story is one of professionalism, of showing up when least expected, and staying prepared even when the odds say you won't be used. In a squad haunted by ego clashes, media pressure, and tactical dysfunction, Dawson represented the opposite. A humble servant to the shirt, ready to answer the call, even if the call never came again. Few defenders in English football have been spoken of with such quiet reverence as Ledley King. He was the kind of player whose mere presence brought calm, smooth on the ball, unflappable under pressure, and blessed with a natural sense of timing that let him glide through games like a silent general. But there was always one brutal asterisk next to his name. His body was broken. By 2010, King hadn't trained properly in years. His chronic knee problems were so severe that at Tottenham he was excused from all full contact training sessions. He would rest during the week, then show up on match day and perform like nothing was wrong, a remarkable balancing act of pain management and sheer talent. That year he had helped Spurs secure a top four finish, reminding everyone of the Rolls-Royce defender England once hoped would partner Rio Ferdinand for a decade. So when Ferdinand was ruled out days before England's opener, Fabio Capello turned to King, his plan B perhaps, but one laced with quality and calm. Starting against the USA, King was composed early on. He dealt with Josie Altidor's physicality, passed with assurance and helped steady a backline under unexpected pressure. But then, just before half-time, it happened again. A groin strain, another injury, another cruel twist. King was subbed off at the break, replaced by Jamie Carragher, and just like that, his tournament was over. Scans confirmed he wouldn't recover in time to feature again. It was another chapter in the painful pattern that had defined his career, a world-class talent trapped inside a body that wouldn't cooperate. Capello had gambled on King's fitness and it hadn't paid off. His absence created a ripple effect. England's defence was shuffled, Upson was brought in and cohesion at the back was lost. Some argued that taking King at all was a mistake. Others said, looking at England's defensive woes later in the tournament, that he was their best chance of stability. Ledley King's World Cup story wasn't one of failure, it was a story of endurance, of a player who defied logic just to make it onto the pitch and whose fleeting appearance reminded us for 45 minutes just how good he could have been. His career is filled with what-ifs, and 2010 was his final one on the world stage. By the time the 2010 World Cup rolled around, Jamie Carragher had already walked away from England. In 2007, disillusioned with being forever seen as a backup behind the likes of Ferdinand, Terry and King, he announced his international retirement. A warrior for Liverpool, yes, but always a reserve for his country. He'd made peace with it. But Fabio Capello hadn't. When injuries began to pile up in the lead up to South Africa, Capello made the call, asking Carragher to come out of retirement. England needed depth, experience, someone who wouldn't be overwhelmed on the world stage. Carragher agreed, reluctantly. He admitted later that he did it more for duty than desire. He'd been on the beach, mentally and physically, when the call came. Then Rio Ferdinand went down, Ledley King followed, and suddenly Carragher, who hadn't played for England in 3 years, found himself starting against Algeria in a must-win group game, with the nation's hopes and spotlight suddenly upon him again. But this wasn't the Carragher of Istanbul. This wasn't the gritty, in-his-prime centre-back who threw himself in front of everything. It had been a long season. He was short of pace, short of sharpness. Against the USA, coming off the bench for the injured King, he looked rusty. Against Algeria, he held the line but struggled to contain even a modest attack, relying on experience over athleticism. Then came the moment that summed up his short-lived World Cup return. A yellow card for a clumsy foul, his second in as many matches, meaning he was suspended for the final group game. It was a quiet exit. He never played for England again. Carragher's brief World Cup cameo felt like what it was, an emergency patch on a sinking ship. He had stepped up when asked, but this was no redemption arc, no glorious swan song. He was a man out of time, out of place, and perhaps deep down still questioning why he was ever there in the first place. In the end, Carragher's 2010 story is less about failure and more about the cost of a flawed system, one that had failed to build long-term depth and had to rely on ghosts of the past when the future wasn't ready.
Of all the players in England's 2010 World Cup squad, Matthew Upson may have had the strangest arc, from fourth-choice centre-back to starter in the most pivotal match of the tournament. His story is a blend of quiet professionalism and public exposure, a man who did his job and yet became a symbol of England's tactical unravelling. Coming into the tournament, Upson was never supposed to be in the 11. Behind Ferdinand, Terry and Ledley King in the pecking order, he was considered reliable if unremarkable. The kind of centre-back who would quietly get through 90 minutes without fuss but rarely stole headlines. At West Ham, he'd captained the side, brought leadership to a struggling defence and earned Capello's trust, not with flair but with steadiness. But when injuries struck, Ferdinand gone before a ball was kicked, King injured after just 45 minutes and Carragher suspended, Upson suddenly found himself starting against Slovenia in a high-stakes group finale. And he delivered. Alongside John Terry, Upson helped England keep a clean sheet in a nervy 1-0 win. It was his best moment in an England shirt. Solid, composed, dependable. Then came Germany. Capello, sticking with the partnership that had brought some stability, started Upson in the round of 16. And in a match that would become infamous, Upson experienced both the dream and the nightmare of World Cup football. In the 37th minute, England were already 2-0 down when Upson rose highest to meet a Gerrard cross and nodded home a brilliant header past Manuel Neuer. It was a lifeline. It was belief. It was his first and only England goal, and for a brief window, it looked like England might mount a comeback. Then came the infamous Lampard ghost goal, and then the collapse. Upson, alongside a tiring Terry, was torn apart by the speed and ruthlessness of Germany's counterattacks. Ozil and Müller danced through England's lines, exploiting space behind the defence, and Upson, brave but outpaced, simply couldn't cope. He was exposed again and again. When the whistle blew on the 4-1 defeat, his name was stamped onto the post-mortem. Some fans turned on him. Others, more sympathetic, saw the bigger picture. Upson had been thrown into a broken system. England's midfield offered no protection, the back line was makeshift, and Germany were a level above. Upson hadn't failed. He'd been asked to fight with a wooden shield against a machine. He never played for England again, and yet Upson remains one of the few England players to score in a World Cup knockout match. His goal, a defiant leap in the face of collapse, is proof of a player who never stopped trying, even as the world around him fell apart.
In every World Cup squad, there's a player who is there but barely seen. Not quite a passenger, but not far off. For England in 2010, that player was Stephen Warnock. A dependable left-back, known for his grit and work ethic at club level, Warnock made the 23-man squad for South Africa, and yet never played a single minute. His inclusion surprised many. With Ashley Cole nailed on as England's first-choice left-back, most expected Leighton Baines to be his understudy, but Baines pulled out, citing issues with form and confidence. That opened the door for Warnock, who had just finished a solid season with Aston Villa, helping them to a 6th-place finish and 2 domestic cup finals. He wasn't flashy, he wasn't a modern fullback in the attacking mould, but he was hard-working, defensively focused and disciplined, a Capello type, and that, really, was the extent of it. Warnock didn't feature in any of England's 4 games. In fact, he didn't even warm up to come on. Ashley Cole played every minute and Capello never once looked to rotate or experiment. Warnock was in the squad, but not in the manager's mind. In interviews years later, Warnock admitted he never expected to play, that his job was to support, to train hard and to be ready just in case. But even without game time, being part of that 2010 camp left its mark. Warnock watched firsthand as England unravelled. The infighting, the lack of tactical clarity, the fear. He saw the pressure weigh down on teammates, the cracks in Capello's rigid system. He was a witness to the breakdown, just without the burden of carrying it on the pitch. For Warnock, the World Cup wasn't about glory or legacy. It was about being there, about earning the shirt, even if he didn't wear it under the lights. His is a story of the squad man, the professional who does his job in silence, with no highlight reel, but no scandal either. He never played another game for England, but if being picked for your country's World Cup squad is the dream of every boy who's ever kicked a ball, then Stephen Warnock lived it, even if it was from the shadows of the sideline. In South Africa, John Terry arrived with a crown no longer on his head and a point to prove. Earlier that year, he had been stripped of the England captaincy by Fabio Capello after a scandal involving teammate Wayne Bridge and allegations of betrayal off the pitch. It was a seismic moment, the kind that could fracture a squad. Terry, once the immovable centre of England's defence and identity, was now a senior player without a title. But if he had lost the armband, he hadn't lost his voice. Terry was still, by every visible measure, England's loudest leader. On the pitch, he barked instructions. In training, he took command. And in the dressing room, it was clear he hadn't let go of the captaincy in spirit. The tournament began with Terry as one half of Capello's preferred central pairing alongside Ledley King. But King's injury in the opener shifted everything. And as the backline rotated between Carragher and Upson, Terry remained the one constant. He threw himself into every tackle, every header, as if trying to prove he still belonged at the centre of England's footballing psyche. But the cracks were showing, not just in the defence, but in the squad dynamic. After a stale 0-0 draw with Algeria, with England sleepwalking through the group stage, Terry took matters into his own hands, not just on the pitch, but in front of the press. In a now infamous press conference, Terry publicly criticised Capello's tactics, hinted at a player's revolt, and declared that the squad needed to have a meeting about how to move forward. It was a bold move, one part passion, one part power play, but it backfired. Capello was furious. Players distanced themselves from Terry's remarks, and suddenly the man who had once been England's emotional heartbeat was being painted as a destabilising force. Still, on the pitch, Terry never hid. Against Slovenia, he delivered a vintage performance, making a heroic diving block that embodied the do-or-die spirit he had always been known for. And when England were torn apart by Germany in the round of 16, Terry was there in the wreckage, shouting, sliding, chasing shadows. Outpaced, yes, but never absent. He left the tournament bloodied but still fighting. His passion was never in doubt. His leadership, even unofficial, was relentless. But in 2010, John Terry was a symbol of the confusion at England's core, a team caught between old loyalties and new systems, between individual fire and collective failure. He had once captained the golden generation, now he was its last soldier standing. In a World Cup campaign defined by disappointment and dysfunction, Ashley Cole was a rare constant. England's most dependable player, and arguably their best. No scandals, no mistakes, no tactical confusion, just world-class performances game after game, delivered with clinical calmness on the left flank. By 2010, Cole was at the peak of his powers, the best left-back in the world, and he knew it. Coming off a stellar season with Chelsea, where he'd won the domestic double under Carlo Ancelotti, Cole entered the tournament as a player in complete control of his game. He could bomb forward with speed and intelligence, track back with ease, and lock down elite wingers with frightening consistency. While much of England's squad struggled to meet expectations, Cole didn't put a foot wrong. Against the USA, he kept Landon Donovan, the most dangerous American attacker, largely quiet, showing the kind of positional discipline that made even elite wingers hesitate. Against Algeria, as England stumbled through a forgettable 0-0, Cole was one of the few who played with urgency and precision, trying to make things happen from the flanks when the midfield stalled. He was never flashy, never loud, but he was absolutely vital. Tactically, he offered balance. With Glenn Johnson often venturing forward recklessly on the right, Cole's ability to recover defensively prevented England from being exposed on the opposite side. His timing in tackles was elite, his crossing sharp. He played every minute of the tournament, and unlike many around him, he played like he belonged there. Even in the round of 16 humiliation against Germany, a 4-1 loss that ripped the soul out of England's World Cup dream, Cole held his ground. While England's centre-backs were carved apart by Germany's ruthless counter-attacks, Cole remained one of the few outfield players who didn't buckle under pressure. He wasn't at fault for the goals, he didn't panic, he simply did his job even when the system collapsed around him. And that was the story of Ashley Cole in 2010. Professionalism in a tournament that lacked it, quality in a team chasing it, and control in the middle of a storm. He never scored, he didn't need to. He didn't make headlines, he didn't crave them. But when England fans look back at who actually performed in South Africa, Cole's name was always there. Quiet, consistent, and unquestionably world-class.
If Ashley Cole was England's defensive pillar on the left, then Glenn Johnson was the gamble on the right, a fullback whose strengths lay going forward.
not back. Coming into the 2010 World Cup, Johnson had just completed a strong season at Liverpool, where his driving runs and attacking instincts made him one of the Premier League's most dangerous right-backs. Fabio Capello saw him as a weapon, someone who could stretch opposition defences and offer width when England's midfield felt stale. But that choice came with a cost. Johnson started all 4 of England's games in South Africa. In the group stage, his intent was clear from the beginning. Against the USA, he constantly overlapped Aaron Lennon, delivering crosses and providing attacking support when the central players were too rigid. But with every surge forward came a question: who was watching his back? Defensively, Johnson was often exposed. While his pace allowed him to recover from some of his own positioning lapses, he lacked the awareness and composure of his counterpart Cole. Against Slovenia and Algeria, he got caught up the pitch more than once, forcing Terry or Upson to cover wide, which in turn left the middle vulnerable. But Capello didn't bench him, and for good reason. In a squad starved of creativity and spark, Johnson was one of the few who looked like making something happen. His close control and sharp acceleration made him a dangerous outlet, especially in the narrow, risk-averse system England deployed. He wasn't just bombing down the flank for the sake of it, he was trying to inject urgency into a team stuck in second gear. Then came Germany, and the limits of his game were fully tested. Up against the likes of Podolski and Ozil, Johnson struggled to track runners and got pulled out of position repeatedly. In moments where defensive discipline was critical, his natural attacking tendencies became a liability. And yet, you could never question his commitment. He sprinted, he chased, he threw himself into tackles. But England didn't need just energy, they needed structure, and Johnson, for all his drive, wasn't offering enough of it defensively. In many ways, Glenn Johnson was a microcosm of that 2010 England team. Talented, brave, but tactically unbalanced. He was a modern fullback stuck in an old-school system, caught between freedom and discipline, instinct and instruction. He returned home without major criticism, but without much praise either. Just like the team, his tournament ended in a whimper. A performance full of effort, some flair, and questions about what might have been, with better support behind and around him.
In South Africa, Joe Hart was the future, but not yet the present. At just 23 years old, he was the youngest of England's 3 goalkeepers and the only one who hadn't been tarnished by disappointment or nerves on the biggest stage. His call-up to the 2010 squad was a nod to what was coming, a quiet recognition that Hart would soon be England's number 1. But when the moment came for heroes and scapegoats, Hart was left watching, gloved hands on the bench, eyes fixed on a drama he couldn't change. At the time, Hart was emerging fast. He just finished a sensational season on loan at Birmingham City, where his commanding displays had earned him the club's Player of the Season award and a PFA Young Player of the Year nomination. Shot-stopping, agility, confidence, Hart had it all. More importantly, he didn't yet carry the mental baggage that weighed down his rivals. Rob Green, the supposed starter, buckled under the pressure in England's opener, letting Clint Dempsey's tame shots squirm through his gloves in a moment that shook the team and sent Capello scrambling. David James, experienced but 39 and slowing, was brought in for the remaining games and did well to restore some stability. Hart remained unused, the promising option but untested. Capello wasn't about to roll the dice with a keeper whose last cap had come in a pre-tournament friendly, and so Hart waited. There was no highlight moment, no mistake, no miracle save. His tournament was silence and shadows, the learning curve of watching from the sidelines while 2 careers played out above him, one ending, the other collapsing. But behind the scenes, those weeks mattered. Hart saw the pressure, he saw the fear in the dressing room, the cracks in the system, the weight of expectation. When he returned to Manchester City, it was with a fire. He would soon claim the number 1 shirt for club and for country, and for several years he would be the trusted last line of England's defence. In that sense, the 2010 World Cup wasn't Hart's moment, but it was his launchpad. A quiet tournament for a goalkeeper who would soon become the loudest voice in England's back line. When England announced their starting goalkeeper for the opening match against the USA, Rob Green was the man chosen to carry the hopes of a nation. Experienced, steady and reliable, Green had been England's first choice through the qualifiers and seemed the natural pick. But in a cruel twist of fate, the dream quickly turned into a nightmare. Just 20 minutes into the match, a moment of rare vulnerability shattered everything. Clint Dempsey's tame shot from close range seemed destined for an easy save, until it slipped through Green's fingers and into the net. The stadium fell silent. England's confidence took a devastating blow. Green's error became instantly iconic, replayed endlessly and dissected mercilessly by fans, pundits and the media alike. That moment defined Green's tournament, and to an extent his entire international career. Yet beyond the glaring mistake was a goalkeeper who had earned his place through hard work and consistent performances at club level. Green was no stranger to pressure. His Premier League career had been built on solid shot stopping and calm presence, but the World Cup stage is unforgiving, and one error can become a lifetime label. After the opening game, Green was swiftly dropped. Fabio Capello called upon veteran David James to replace him, and Green was left to watch from the sidelines as England struggled through the rest of the tournament. His absence was palpable. The loss of confidence and cohesion in goal mirrored the wider team's unravelling. In interviews afterward, Green spoke openly about the emotional toll, the public scrutiny, and the weight of carrying a nation's disappointment. But he never shied away from responsibility. Instead, he used the experience as motivation to rebuild his career, showing resilience in the face of one of English football's most infamous World Cup moments. Rob Green's 2010 World Cup story is a tragic reminder of how at the highest level, a single moment can eclipse years of dedication. But it also reveals the human side of football, a man caught in the spotlight, faltering once, but still standing in the storm that followed.
The experienced guardian called back to duty. At 39 years old, David James was far from the future. His international career had spanned over a decade, marked by highs and lows, heroic saves, and some infamous blunders. When England's World Cup campaign started with a shock defeat to the USA, marred by Rob Green's costly error, it seemed the team needed a steady hand between the sticks. Enter James, the elder statesman, the goalkeeper with experience that money couldn't buy. Though initially not expected to feature, James was thrust into action by Fabio Capello for the next 3 group games and the round of 16 clash against Germany. His presence was a calming influence on a defence already struggling with injuries and inconsistency. Unlike Green, James brought a level of composure that steadied the back line, if not the entire team. In the group stage, he helped England keep clean sheets against Algeria and Slovenia, 2 hard-fought results that were enough to get the Three Lions into the knockout phase. His shot stopping was reliable, his command of the box assured, and he was vocal in organising the defence. James wasn't spectacular, but he didn't need to be. He was the steady hand in turbulent waters. But even his best efforts couldn't stop the inevitable against Germany. In the round of 16, England were outclassed and outpaced, and though James made several saves, the defence was overwhelmed. The 4-1 loss was brutal, and while James's performance wasn't the cause, it marked the end of England's tournament and James's final World Cup appearance. James's story in South Africa was one of professionalism and resilience. Called up late to fill a sudden void, he embraced the challenge, showing that even at the twilight of his career, he could still perform at the highest level. His calm under pressure contrasted sharply with the turmoil around him. For England fans, David James was a reminder of experience and dedication, a guardian who, despite the odds, gave his all for the shirt when it mattered most.
The 2010 England World Cup squad was a team of contrasts. World-class talent mixed with off-field turmoil. Moments of brilliance overshadowed by tactical rigidity and unexpected heartbreak. From the quiet professionalism of Ashley Cole to the heartbreaking mistake of Rob Green, from John Terry's complex leadership to Joe Hart's silent patience on the sidelines, this squad's story is one of hope, pressure, and ultimately unfulfilled potential. Despite the high expectations, England's campaign in South Africa exposed deep flaws, a lack of cohesion, leadership struggles, and an inability to adapt when the stakes were highest. But every player in that squad, whether on the pitch or off it, contributed to a story that still sparks debate today. The 2010 World Cup wasn't the ending England fans dreamed of, but it remains a vivid chapter in the nation's football history, a reminder that talent alone isn't enough without unity, strategy, and resilience.
Thanks for watching this deep dive into the players who carried the Three Lions in 2010. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more football stories that go beyond the headlines.